Story 1. I know what you're thinking. How could an ice cream truck be scary? Spoiler, there wasn't actually an ice cream truck, but just hang around and listen. To set the scene, I was about 12 at the time. I and some of my friends were at summer camp in northern Iowa. I don't want to say the name of this place because it wasn't at all their fault. We actually really liked it there and don't want to give them a bad name. What happened was that one day we were out with one of the counselors, just walking through the woods, enjoying nature. I'll call our counselor Jake for the purposes of this story, and my friends will be Dan, Lucas, and Jeremy. About halfway into our hike, which was through a forest on some hills, Lucas asked us if we heard music. At first we thought he was joking, but then I heard it too. It was very faint, but sounded like something you'd hear at an amusement park. Noticing that Lucas and I were quiet, Jake shushed the rest of us so we could all listen. Sure enough, the music was still going, though none of us knew where it was coming from. It seemed like it was coming from somewhere on the next hill down the path, but we weren't sure. It was at that point that Jeremy joked it was an ice cream truck, and oddly enough, the music did sound like it could come from one. But that didn't make any sense, since we were deep into the forest, and I don't think there were any roads nearby. It also didn't make sense because, well, we were deep into the forest, so who would buy ice cream? I remember that Jake thought about heading back, since we didn't know who or what was out there, but Dan, Lucas, and Jeremy and I urged him to keep going, since we and the other kids on the hike were curious to see what it was. Altogether, there were like 5 other kids. After what seemed like a minute or two, the music stopped, and Jake told us that we could keep going, but if we heard the music again, we need to turn back. We agreed and walked on excitedly. The plan had been for us to hike for another half hour or so, which would lead us to a scenic overlook where we could sit and eat the food we brought. This was the first summer that Lucas and I had been to the camp, so we'd never been there before, though Dan and Jeremy had come here before. They joked that there was an ice cream truck on the top of the hill, and we all laughed, though Jake didn't think it was funny. Finally, we got to where we were going, and the view was rather breathtaking, I have to say. We could see for miles, with nothing but the forest on the hills coming into view. About 10 minutes into our lunch, we noticed some of the kids fall silent and cock their heads to the side. We stopped talking too, and sure enough, there was the music. At this point, Jake told us to pack up our food because we'd be heading back, and he looked concerned. The music was now a little louder, and I almost thought I heard someone talking over the music. It sounded like a man's voice, and almost a little deranged. It was hard to describe. Jake became even more concerned when he realized it was coming from the way back, which seemed to imply that whoever was playing the music had somehow moved around us when we were making our way to the overlook. Then it stopped after a minute or two, leaving just the sounds of nature. There was really only one way back, at least as far as we knew, and after deliberating briefly, Jake told us that we'd head back the way we came, but that we'd have to stay close together. He also told us to be quiet. Jake was actually one of the more outgoing counselors, and it was a bit unsettling to see him this concerned. However, it also increased our excitement, as me, my friends, and the rest of the kids joked that we are trying to escape from the Ice Cream Mountain Killer. Yeah, we really like to come up with dumb names like that. As we made our way back, me and my friends were bringing up the rear when all of a sudden the kids in front of us stopped. The music had just started up again. We could see the kids in front of us whisper something to Jake, who immediately stopped walking and held up his fist. It took us a few moments to spot it, but there was a man about 50 feet below us on the hill, just standing there, looking outward. He wasn't on any trail, at least not that we knew, and it was hard to get a good look at him. As we listened, we could make out what sounded like a quiet conversation, like maybe a phone call. But there wasn't reception in this area, and the talking sounded a bit odd. We figured he most likely had some kind of mental condition and was just talking to himself. Slowly, we continued on the trail past him. My friends and I were more afraid now, but I'd be lying if I didn't say we weren't still excited. When we were almost at a point when we couldn't see him anymore, like in any good horror movie, Jeremy stepped on a tree branch and made a kind of loudish sound. Jake turned around with his finger to his lips and made an intense facial expression, and Jeremy looked sorry and nodded. But that didn't really matter, because our blood ran cold as we heard the man's voice get a lot louder and angrier. We also heard the sound of manic footsteps running towards us. Everyone turned around and saw the man running towards us, and when I say running, I mean a full-on sprint. At that moment, we all screamed and then started running away like little girls, I'm pretty sure Jake included. I didn't get the best look at the guy, but from what I remember, he was middle-aged. He was also thin with wiry, greasy hair, and he was wearing jorts and a ripped t-shirt. His eyes looked completely deranged, as did his jaw when it opened wide to yell at us. After about a minute or so, the sounds of him screaming and chasing us started to fade away, but we didn't stop booking it all the way back to our cabin. When we got there, we took a moment to catch our breath, and then I'm pretty sure Jake went straight to the admin building and reported what happened. It turned into a whole big incident. The cops were called and took statements from us, and I'm pretty sure they sent a search party out into the woods. The camp was also closed and our parents had to come pick us up. I and my friends were actually upset because we liked camp, but looking back, I'm not sure what else the camp administrators could have done. There was a madman on the loose in the forest after all. We also never got more of the backstory as to who that man was or what he was doing. Our main theory was that he had been hiding out in the forest, using the sound of an ice cream truck to lure unsuspecting children to him, and then doing God knows what. There's one more thing I want to mention. The second night after we got to camp, Jeremy and I were playing games on his Nintendo Switch after everyone had gone to sleep. We heard the door to our cabin opening, and quickly got back in our beds and pretended we were asleep too. We figured it was one of the camp counselors, and that he'd just look in and close the door, but we didn't hear the door close though. Instead, we heard what sounded like low mumbling. It seemed to go on for about a minute or so. Jeremy and I tried to hear what he was saying, but we couldn't. Eventually the door did close, and we resumed playing with Jeremy's Switch. Now I'm not sure if that really was a camp counselor, but one thing's for sure. That freaks me out, knowing that we might have had a crazed lunatic come into our cabin at night. Story 2. We've all been to carnivals, and usually we have some fun memories there. However, the carnival that came to our town was notorious for being sketchy as hell. My friends and I would go there after school when it visited us, though there actually wasn't that much to do there. It was definitely on the smaller side, and some of the rides always seemed to be broken down. We'd usually just go on the Tilt-A-Whirl, the Funhouse, and try some of the classic carnival games like throwing darts at balloons. As we got older, we got less interested though, and mainly just used going there as an excuse to put off doing our homework. The last time it visited us, me and my two friends went there. I'll call my friends Peter and Joey for the sake of the story. After stopping by Joey's house to get snacks, we started walking over to the carnival, which was located in the parking lot of a stadium. I think the stadium was owned by the school district, and a lot of the high schools would have games there, but it's not important to the story. Anyway, we all got there at around 5 p.m. and were deciding what to do first. There were never many people there, so there wouldn't really be any wait for any of the attractions. Peter wanted to go on the Tilt-A-Whirl, while I wanted to go through the Funhouse. We decided to do the Tilt-A-Whirl first, and a few minutes later, we were walking over to the Funhouse. At that moment, Joey, Peter, and I turned to see a white van backing up next to one of the rides. Like everything else, it was super sketchy, and it was actually what you'd expect from a child kidnapper. It was painted white but was pretty dirty, and it didn't have any windows in the back. We made a joke about how a man would pop out and say he had candy and puppies inside. At first we assumed that the van belonged to the carnival workers, and had some equipment for one of the rides. However, we were surprised when the back doors opened and a man did pop out. But he didn't seem to be tricking us with candy or puppies though. He did have on a dirty white A-frame t-shirt and ripped shorts. He immediately made eye contact and gave us a rather disgusting smile. We laughed, but we were also getting creeped out. The man motioned for us to come over. None of us really wanted to though, but we didn't want to seem chicken. So we slowly walked over, and as we came closer, we got a whiff of the man's body odor. It wasn't pleasant to say the least. When we were about 10 feet away, he asked us if we wanted any ice cream. We nervously looked at each other and said nothing. Then he went on that he was selling ice cream, and that his regular ice cream truck had a flat tire, so we had to use this one. We really didn't buy that for a moment, but none of us wanted to call the guy out on it though. He then asked us what flavors we liked, and Peter managed to say, no thanks. The man just looked at us for a moment, and then told us that his freezer was breaking down, and that the ice cream would be free. He again asked us what flavor we wanted. I think after that, Peter said something like, no, just an ice cream sandwich. The man looked at him, and then looked at me and Joey. He almost seemed like he was sizing us up, thinking about if he could take us or not. After a few moments, he went back into the van, and then came back out holding an individually wrapped ice cream sandwich. He handed it to Peter, who just stuck out his hand and then pulled it back. It looked like something you get in a box at a store. Peter looked back at the man, who this time wasn't smiling. He actually seemed to be a bit upset. We were all uncomfortable, and I said, thanks. It was then that we started to back away. The man kept watching us though, and when we were almost out of sight, we ducked behind the funhouse. Joey, Peter, and I all laughed nervously about what the hell just happened, and joked that Peter should just eat the ice cream sandwich. Of course he wasn't going to do it though, and Joey and I weren't either. We joked that Peter should light it on fire, but we didn't have a match, so we just tossed it in a garbage can. Then we started thinking about whether or not we should report that man. We all kind of decided that he probably didn't work for the carnival, and he might have actually been trying to lure children. We decided to ask one of the carnival workers if that man worked there. The worker had no idea who we were talking about. Then we asked another one, and he had no idea either. At that point, we weren't sure what to do next. Should we call the cops? We honestly didn't know what to do. At that moment, we heard a scream, and everyone in our part of the carnival fell silent. We turned our heads in the direction it came from, and there was the van. There was a girl, maybe about 10, crying while the man was standing over her. Someone else started shouting, and the man looked up and then ran back into his van. The doors closed, and a second later we heard the engine start and saw the van pull away. An older lady bolted over to the girl, and we assumed she was her mother or maybe grandmother. They were both crying and hugging each other, and a few bystanders came over as well. The cops were called, obviously, but we have no idea if they caught that guy or not. The carnival didn't actually close down immediately after this happened. Apparently whoever ran it just wanted to keep it open, but I think the cops persuaded them to tell the visitors to go home so as not to have a kid get kidnapped. Thinking about what happened still freaks us out to this day. Another thing is that we were all scared in the moment, and I don't know which of us, if any, would have been brave enough to save that girl had she needed it. I don't like that feeling, and if I'm ever in another situation like that, I just hope I'm brave enough. Story 3. I've been an ice cream truck driver for 2 decades, and I don't plan on retiring anytime soon. I've lived and driven a few different places, mostly around Chicago. Over the years, I've had the pleasure to meet many different people, and I could write a book about all the funny, odd, scary, and interesting experiences I've had. However, there's still one story that still haunts me to this day. For privacy reasons, I won't go into the details, but that won't really change the story. I've been driving for about 5 years after buying my first truck out of high school. I was still making payments on it, and for the stuff inside, and money was kind of tight, but I was still making it. That summer, I started to branch out and try different routes, looking for places with good parking and more customers. Contrary to popular belief, most of my customers tended to be adults, who'd walk outside during their lunch breaks. As such, office parks could actually be worthwhile to visit, and on this particular day, I went to one I'd never been to before. It wasn't a skyscraper, rather, it was only about 5 stories tall. This was in a relatively nice area of town, so I wasn't too concerned about safety. There were some tables and chairs in a little garden outside, and as I pulled up, I saw a few people look in my direction. I didn't usually have to put the sound on, they'd just come over. This time I had a pretty good haul, making about $50 in the span of 10 minutes or so. After everyone had gotten their ice cream or snacks, yes, we sell other things besides ice cream, a man slightly older than me came over to my truck. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't dressed in business clothes, and he seemed a bit off. He talked very enthusiastically and had a bit of a grin on his face. He quickly stuck out his hand and introduced himself as Rad. Not Rod or Rob, but Rad. I reached out of the window and shook his hand and told him my name was Stan. Rad started talking about how he had loved getting ice cream at ice cream trucks as a kid, and asked me questions like how long I'd been an ice cream truck driver and what my favorite flavor was. I didn't actually mind making small talk, but something about this encounter was just strange. I couldn't put my finger on it, but as the conversation kept going, I started to get uncomfortable. For one thing, he was making a lot of eye contact, so much so that he almost never looked away, and he was still talking kind of fast. Eventually, he asked me if I ever sold ice cream at special events, and I told him that I had a few times before. He asked me if I could help with his niece's birthday party. I told him, yeah, sure, and asked when it was. Then he told me something strange. He said it was later this evening at 6 p.m. I thought about that for a moment, and then asked him where it was. He said it would be right here, and motioned behind him. I was confused. I asked him if he meant the office park, and he let out a quick laugh. No, silly, he said, right behind here. He again motioned behind him, but when I looked I couldn't see anything behind this particular building. Overall, we were in a business district, which didn't seem like it would be the ideal place for a little kid's party. But of course I was confused and suspicious about the whole story. I tried asking him more questions, but he seemed like he didn't want to give me answers. I asked him what his niece's name was, how old she was, how many kids would be there, and if his niece liked anything special. Most of the time he'd just give me one-word answers, and I could start to see him get annoyed. After what seemed like 5 minutes, he took out his wallet and shoved a $100 bill in my hand. He smiled and asked if that would cover it. I told him possibly, as I still hadn't come to grips with the conversation. He smiled again and said that he'd pay me the rest after the party, and then some. I thought about it for a moment, and I'm still not sure why, but I decided to take the money and come back later for the party. Rad seemed very excited and told me I wouldn't regret it. What it was, I wasn't sure, but I was still a bit nervous. After making a few more stops, I went over to Costco and stocked up. I got my usual stuff, which included both ice cream and other snacks, and then stopped back by my apartment and had a sandwich. Eventually it was time to go, and I walked back down to my truck and drove over. At this point it was starting to get a bit dark, though it was still warm out. I arrived back at the office park a few minutes before 6, and then waited. Rad told me he'd meet me right there, so that's where I stayed. It then dawned on me that I could drive around a bit and try to find the party. In fact, I kicked myself for not realizing that sooner. Slowly I pulled out of the parking lot and started to make the block. There were a few other office buildings and a few cars left in the lot, but mostly it was deserted. It took me just a minute or two to get back to where I had been, and to my dismay, I didn't see any kind of park or other place to have a kid's birthday party for that matter. So I started waiting again. Hell, there wasn't much else to do. The man didn't give me his phone number. I decided to lower my window and listen, but I didn't really hear anything. It was also past 6, and Rad was nowhere to be seen. I thought it might have been a joke, but he had in fact given me $100. At 6:20, I was debating whether or not to drive off, when I thought I heard a conversation somewhere in the distance. I assumed it was from the office building, but I wasn't really sure. But what happened next made my blood run cold. I heard one single, loud scream, and then what sounded like a metallic sound. Then everything went silent. My heart was racing, and I had no idea what to do. Sure, I was sketched out, but I hadn't been prepared to deal with this situation. Should I drive off and call the cops? Should I try to confront the guy? I didn't have time to think, because after a split second I saw someone running into view. It was Rad, and he was running right at my truck. I started to roll up the window when he came up to it and shouted to open the passenger door. I asked him what was going on, and that's when he hit my car door with his fist and yelled at me that he didn't have time. At that point I froze, again not knowing what to do. Rad looked over his shoulder and then started running around the front of my truck. In what is perhaps my most vivid memory, I put the truck in reverse and floored it. Rad fell forward and started yelling and then put his hands up and walked towards me. When I was about 50 feet away, I put it in drive and sped out of the parking lot. He kept screaming, and then I heard something hitting the back of my truck. It wasn't a gunshot, it sounded more like a brick or a hammer. When I was a few blocks away, I dialed 911 and explained the situation, all the while looking around me for Rad or any suspicious vehicles. The cops showed up 15 minutes later, and I got their attention. They came up to me and I gave a statement, and then we went over and I showed them where I and Rad had been. What still haunts me to this day is the fact that they didn't find anything. I had given another statement 2 days later, and I even checked the missing persons report for several months after that, but nothing turned up. I can only assume that what I heard was a kidnapping or a murder, and I felt ashamed that I didn't do anything to stop it. I've only told a few family members and close friends over the years, and they all agreed that it wasn't my fault and there was nothing I could have done. Still, I blame myself, and I just hope that whoever was in trouble got away and that that man was brought to justice.